Hi, and welcome to Lessons in Humanities. The topic of today's lesson is British America. Uh, I have two other lessons before this. I'm going from Native American culture all the way to 2020 in this series. But if you're interested in the first two lessons, the first one is more about Native Americans, and the second one is about Spanish America before the British came. Please check out my YouTube site. Also, if you're interested in this PPT and other educational resources, please look below. I have a link to my TPT store, and you can check out some of these PPTs or other resources that you might find useful if you're learning American history or if you are a teacher. But let's begin. So this is about British America, and of course, British America, or at least in the beginning, at least English America, it was in 1607 in Jamestown. That's when it began. And then it would go until 1776 when the United States began. But I'd just like to review a little bit about what I spoke about in the last two lessons. And of course, the first is about Native Americans and all the many different cultures and languages and religions and ways of life that existed in the New World or in the Americas for thousands and tens of thousands of years before the Europeans came over to the New World. In fact, it was a new world to the Paleo Indians who came possibly 20,000 years ago, whether it was over the Bering Strait or over the oceans. However, they reached the New World. It was a new world for them too, but that was 20,000 years ago. And over that time, as Europe and Asia was developing these great societies and civilizations, so the same thing was happening in the New World, like the Aztecs and the Mayas and Cahokia and different areas in North and Central and South America. And this happened over many years, and they developed these strong civilizations. And of course, it was in 1492 that the Spanish, with Christopher Columbus, an Italian working for Spain, for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, came over and found the New World, which of course he didn't know he found. But nonetheless, this is over a period of 100 years before the British, or it's actually the English. So in this video, I'm going to refer to the English and British kind of interchangeably. It's really just the English until about 1700, and after that it would be Britain. But if I misspeak, please forgive me. But it is about 100 years from about 1492 to 1607, where the Spanish just dominated the New World, and they grew and expanded, and they were getting rich. And of course, they were treating the Native Americans poorly. A lot of reports reported that, right? There was a man named Bartolome de las Casas, and he was a Spanish friar, and he was a religious man, and he wrote reports about the atrocities that were taking place. And some of these reports got back to Europe, and it really made Spain look bad. And it spread to Britain or England. It spread to France and Dutch and some of the Spain's enemies. And this made Spain look really bad. And these other countries said, well, hey, we can go to the New World and we can be better than the Spanish. We can treat the Native Americans better, and it kind of gave justification for them to also colonize the New World. But the real motivation, obviously, is economic. Spain was getting very rich and very powerful, and they dominated the New World. I mean, the Portuguese were in the New World, the Spanish were in the New World, and of course the Native Americans were all from the north to the south, but they were being killed by disease. It was they were being decimated throughout, and of course conflicts with the Spanish. During this time, this is the 1500s. We also see the Protestant Reformation, which is happening in Europe, and it's going to spread. And this is going to split the Catholic Church with the Protestant Church, right? And of course, in Protestantism, there's many different kinds. And I think we'll discuss a little bit about that in this video. But to make it simple, is the Catholics and the Protestants. And in Spain is obviously Catholic. And England is Protestant. And that's going to influence what develops in the New World. So that sets it up. Spain is getting rich. England also wants to colonize, but Spain is too powerful. They control the Atlantic Ocean. In 1588, we have the Spanish Armada. And the Spanish Armada is when Spain tried to take over England, and they should have easily defeated England, but because of weather and small, fast, talented British or English ships, Spain actually lost that, and that opened up the oceans for the Atlantic, for the English, but also for the French and the Dutch, who would also come over. And the French and the Dutch, they came about the same time as the English, really, the early 1600s. I have more details about that in my other videos. Just go to my YouTube site and you will see it. It's called Colliding Cultures. But the English. So this is going to mostly be about, my channel here is, or this series at least, is about United States history. So we have to start with, of course, what Native Americans, because that it's all a part of it, right? And also the Spanish, and then now it's obviously the English. They will become Britain, and they will become the United States of America. But 1607 is when Jamestown started. That was the first colony. It was a business venture. And 1620, we have Plymouth. Those were the Pilgrims, the separatists who were Calvinists who wanted to start have kind of like their own society of practicing their Calvinist religion. And then 1630 is the Puritans. And they were Calvinists like the Pilgrims, but they were non-separatists. They wanted to have a city upon a hill. That's what John Winthrop said. He said, city upon a hill. He and the other Puritans in the Massachusetts Bay Colony wanted to influence England and other countries on how to live a model society. And of course, the Massachusetts Bay Colony would not end up being the model society that he had hoped. But nonetheless, in the Northeast, which we today call New England, in Massachusetts, Plymouth, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, this was a Calvinist, strictly religious society, and they would join to become Massachusetts, right? And then more south or more in the center, we have Virginia, and that was a business venture. And then we have everything in between, right? And Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts Bay Colony, that is also in my last video. So for more details, please visit that. Let's see. So I wanted to go over a little bit about the timeline. Now this timeline, again, if you're interested in this timeline, I have a PDF. Just check out the link below. This is the second timeline. Okay, so as I mentioned in my prior videos, it's good to chunk history into chunks, right? It makes it kind of easier, where you can kind of see, oh, this is when the Spanish were there, or this is the beginning of the English colonization, or this is the beginning of the United States. It makes it a little bit easier to remember, and it might be difficult to remember. In 1588 is the Spanish Armada. Maybe it's just easier to say, okay, well, in the late 1500s, when the Spanish controlled the New World, this happened, and this was influential because, for whatever reason. But my point here is you can kind of chunk it, right? And the first chunk that I had in the last videos was 1491 to 1607. So Native American culture, 1491, which represents tens of thousands of years. And of course, 1492 with Columbus to 1607. That was dominated by the Spanish, but in 1607 is Jamestown, right? And this chunk goes from Jamestown all the way to 1754. And 1754 is when the French are going to fight the British in the New World, and then this is going to give the Britain more power, right? But for this 150 years or so, this is when the more and more colonists, more and more settlers from England and also other countries, the French, the Dutch, the Finns, the Swedes, the Spanish, are going to come into what is modern day America and start these 13 colonies. There'll be more colonies, but it'll be the 13 original colonies that begin the 13 states of the United States of America. But here's a timeline. It's just a reference, and that's what we're going to discuss. What happened over these 150 years? We're going to kind of go back and forth, but The development of the different colonies, the institution of slavery, which is very relevant to American and European history in the New World, and to some of the conflicts that would ensue up until when slavery would end in 1865, and the continuation of discrimination and segregation until the 1960s, and then some conflicts today. It's better to have a good idea of what happened in the past, so you can understand some of the conflicts of today. What conflicts are rational, what conflicts are not rational. So we can learn from the past. That's important. So here's this timeline. Again, check below if you're interested in this PDF. And that brings us to the institution of slavery. Now, slavery has been around the world since man has been in existence, all over the world. This is not an American invention, and it wasn't the English who brought African slaves to the New World. In fact, before the Europeans had even arrived in the New World, Native Americans had slaves. They enslaved each other. They had prisoners of war. Like after a war, they would take the prisoners and they would become slaves. Sometimes for life, sometimes they would be freed after a certain period of time. Or sometimes it didn't even have to be a war. Different tribes would go out and looking for people and they would enslave them. So slavery has been here for thousands of years in the New World and what is today the United States of America and all over the Americas. So it was not a new institution. And you know, if you're familiar with the 1619 Project, that is when the first slave came to the English colonies. Well, African slavery had been here in the New World with the Spanish. It wasn't the English who first brought them. It was the Spanish and the Portuguese. So the Spanish and the Portuguese, they enslaved, well, Native Americans at first, but they also imported African slaves in the 1500s. And the Dutch, right? And it wasn't just the Spanish and the Portuguese and the English, but the Dutch and other European settlers. But basically, the 1500s was dominated by the Spanish, and then also the Portuguese. But the practice of African slavery, well, I mean, of course, in Africa there was slavery within the different tribes. It's kind of like the Native Americans, and it was Africans who sold prisoners of war or captives to the Europeans, who would send them to the New World. You know, in the New World, you have all this land, and they needed laborers. They had too much land, not enough people to work, and that's why this awful institution began. But it should be noted that you know, the African slaves, it was Portugal. You know, and this is not to demonize Portugal. It's not to this is history. We're just learning from the past, right? But Portugal, they began. You know, when in the late 1400s, when the Europeans were trying to find the New World. And trying to get those spices and luxury goods from Asia, and realizing how hard it was to go over land because of the terrain and because of the conflicts with the Muslims in between. They wanted to go over the ocean, and that's what they did. That's what the Portuguese did. They were excellent navigators with their ships and their instruments that could guide them, and they really were inventive. And it's the Portuguese that went below Africa and around Africa to India. So they were the first ones to do it, and that was before the Spanish. I don't believe the Portuguese even thought about going over the Atlantic Ocean, right, to go around the world to get to Asia. I don't know if that was even considered by the Portuguese. I suppose it was. They knew the world was round. The educated people did. But in the 1440s, Portugal, you know, with their exploration along Africa, and they started having colonies in India and in Africa. Built little forts along the coast. They started trading slaves, and they would bring slaves, some to Portugal and some to some islands in the Atlantic Ocean, which are near Europe, like the Canary Islands, where they cultivated sugar, and they brought in African slaves to work there. So this is really kind of the beginning of the African slave trade that would move its way to the New World, because of course it's 50 years before Columbus would come, right? So maybe the 1619 project could be called the 1440 project. I don't know, but as the Spanish and Portuguese did eventually come to the New World, right, after Columbus, so 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. After the Spanish started encroaching and dominating the New World, and then in the 1530s came the Portuguese, they brought in African slaves, right? They enslaved the Native Americans, they brought in African slaves, and this is well before the English came. And if you look on this slide here, it says the first slaves arrived in British America in 1619, Jamestown. So the last class we talked about Jamestown. It was founded in 1607. It's the first permanent English colony that would survive, right? There was one before that disappeared, Roanoke, but this is the first one, 1607, Jamestown. And this colony struggled. The Native Americans had to help them survive, otherwise they would have all died, right? They had the starving period from 1609 to 1610 where people were literally eating dead corpses. You know, there's a story of a man who killed his wife to eat her. They're eating leather. 1607 to 1610 was not good years in Jamestown. These people were not prepared to survive in Jamestown. But they found something in Jamestown. What did they find? Or in Virginia, right? This would be the Virginia colony, but Jamestown was the first settlement. They found tobacco, right? John Rolfe, who married Pocahontas, found tobacco, and actually he imported some tobacco from the Caribbean and started growing in Virginia and sold it in Europe and England, and more people came to cultivate this tobacco, and Jamestown survived, and we would have British America, which I should really call English America at this time, right? 1607. But 12 years after the founding of Jamestown, we have the first African slaves that will be imported, 20 of them on one ship, to cultivate the tobacco, to work in the fields, to work on the land. And this is where the controversial 1619 project comes from. Because that's when the first African slaves came. But it should be noted that it wasn't just the African slaves, there was different type of workers at this time. It wasn't specified or codified in the early 1600s. It wasn't until the mid-1600s that Africans were slaves. Some of them gained their freedom, right? Some of them were brought over as slaves, but they'd work for 5 or 6 years, and then they were given freedom, and they could own land and try to gain wealth like the English settlers. So this was kind of like indentured servitudes, and they had lots of indentured servants from England and Europe come as well. And these were people that were often poor, and they wanted to come to the New World. They couldn't pay for a voyage to the New World, but they wanted to find opportunity. So they willingly came over on ships that were paid for by business people or plantation owners or different type of business ventures, and they would get to the New World, and they would work for a contracted period of time, and when their work was done, they were free, and then they could own land and try to get rich. Some did, some didn't, right? Many of the indentured servants died before their contract was over because the conditions were very terrible in Virginia, and in Massachusetts wasn't as bad as Virginia, but they struggled up there as well. But my point here is, at this time, early on in English America or British America, there were different. They had all this land, and they needed workers, and the workers could have been poor whites, or it could have been indentured servants. It could have been Native Americans, which didn't last long, but they did enslave the Native Americans. And then the Africans were enslaved, and it wasn't codified who was a slave or who wasn't a slave at that time. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so we have the Middle Passage. So this is the notorious Middle Passage, and this is commonly taught as the route from Africa to the New World, to usually the Caribbean or maybe Brazil in South America, or possibly like Charleston in what is now the United States. So it is in English America. But the Middle Passage, it was more than that. It was when Africans were captured, whether it be in war or they were just captured by a rivaling tribe or a African slave trader, and they were captured and then they had to walk or be transferred possibly 100 miles to the coast where they would go to a fort, usually like a Portuguese fort or some type of European fort or some type of building where they were traded with the Europeans who came. That would be the first leg, the grueling, let's say 100-mile hike to the coast, captured. And then the second part is, as you can see here from the boat, is over the Atlantic Ocean, and this is the more famous journey of the Middle Passage. And then the third one is from wherever they were sent to in the New World, whether it be the Caribbean or South America or in British America, journey to their plantation or house or wherever they were going to have to do the labor, which would last for the rest of their lives. Certainly after the 1660s, it would. But the Middle Passage on the boat was awful, and you can just see that from this picture. This is a picture of a regulated slave ship, and eventually they regulated it, right? So you couldn't just stuff 1,000 people into a boat and just send it over the ocean. You had to they had to make regulations. But under these regulations, you can see they're so close. There's no place to move. They're chained. Awful situation to be in for a month or so journey over the ocean. You have to go to the bathroom. You have to. You might get sick. Disease. The smell. It was unimaginable, really. And many of the slaves on this boat, they jumped off. They tried to jump off, right? Some of them would succeed and commit suicide, and some would be brought back and flogged or beaten by the slave traders on the boat. So the conditions were unquestionably awful. There's even stories of them being chained so strictly on their wrist or their legs that the bones would protrude. We get some of these narratives from some primary sources like Equiano. In fact, I'll leave a link to his primary source below. But he talks about, he was supposedly on the slave ship. He was a young boy, and he talks about people trying to commit suicide and the smells. And he's very graphic in his writing. Very smart young man who would win his freedom someday and live in England. And there are some stories that Equiano was actually never on the ship, that he was born in South Carolina, and that his stories are just from what he heard from slaves who were on. I don't know what is true, but nonetheless, I think we can use that source as a relatively reliable source of what the conditions are, but we can only just imagine what it was like on there, right? There's also a guy named Falconbridge. Falconbridge was a surgeon. He was on the ship, and a lot of what we get is from him, and he was, a rich white guy, right? I mean, I guess a surgeon back then would have been pretty well off comparatively, and he also explained some very awful conditions on the slave ship. But it's estimated there's about 12 million slaves Africans that were transported overseas to the New World. And of course, eventually the trade would end, but the practice of slavery would continue in the United States and Brazil and different places. But of course, when the Africans did come to the New World, and they would have babies, and babies would be born into slavery. But it's estimated about 12 million made this passage. About 2 million died on the passage. And in what is the modern day U.S., it's estimated about 450,000 were sent to that area. So So this is known as the Middle Passage, and that's part of the triangular trade, right? Last video, if you watched it, we talked about the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange was after Columbus came and the Europeans, the Spanish came, and the Portuguese and the English, Dutch and French, and other European powers came. This great trade network of all this stuff from the New World going to the Old World, and the Old World going to the New World. You know, in the Old World, when I say Old World, I mean like Europe and Asia and Africa. Stuff that would go to, for example, Europe would include potatoes and corn, and this had a lot of calories, and the population would grow, right, in Europe. Well, in the New World, they got some great stuff like horses, right, and they got some pigs, and they got some other crops and whatnot, but they got diseases, and this is going to be the big difference because this is going to decimate the Native American culture. But along with the Colonial Exchange, and as time went by with the Spanish and then the English, we have what we call the triangular trade. And this was where lots of raw materials and commodities were sent to Europe and England, and they were either consumed or used to make manufactured goods. And those manufactured goods often went to Africa or back to the New World. And when they went to Africa, they were exchanged for African slaves, and these African slaves were sent to the New World, and it was just a cycle back and forth. So this is known as the triangular trade. Just some more comments about slavery. This picture is actually a Portuguese fort that's located in Africa along the coast. I believe Guinea. This is one of the first ones. But going back to English America, Charlestown, which is Charleston, was one of the major ports. So a lot of the slaves were sent to the Caribbean and Brazil and different places, but some were sent to British America, which would one day become the United States of America, or they'd be sent to the Caribbean and up to Charleston. And of course, the 13 colonies, as they developed, it would take over 100 years for 13 colonies to eventually come into existence and then eventually become the United States. But over that period of time, slavery was more prominent in the South because they had lots of land and they needed lots of workers, lots of large plantations. But if you went to, for example, New England or Massachusetts, that area, they had smaller farms. And as time went on, they became more of a manufacturing. That would be their economy, manufacturing. Later on, of course, in 1800s, industrial. But the South really depended on slave labor, whether it be indentured servants, Native Americans, or African slaves. And another topic to mention is in the South, just below the South, were the Spanish, right? And the Spanish had African slaves as well, but they did create a free colony for the for the slaves, because you remember that the Spanish are Catholics and the English are mostly Protestant, and the Catholics and Protestants didn't get along. I mean, I think you can still see disagreements to this day between the two denominations of Christianity, but they didn't get along, and the Spanish and the English were enemies. They had fought wars, and to disrupt the development of the British colonies, the English colonies, they created a free society for some African slaves to come down near St. Augustine and be free, right? They just had to be loyal to the Spanish king and queen, and also convert to Catholics, and then they could go there and they could live a free life. So that did take place. In British America, slavery, this is over a long period of time, so this is a big generalization, but as I mentioned in the beginning, it wasn't codified who was a slave and who wasn't. It would come to the point where Africans were slaves, and if you were born African American, you would be a slave. And if you had a white mom or dad and a black mom or dad, and you were a mulatto, you would be considered a slave. And there were abolitionists, right? The Quakers in Pennsylvania were against slavery, and people were speaking about it, about the institution of slavery. But it did continue, and I will mention that by the time they wrote the Declaration of Independence, right, in 1776, even Thomas Jefferson, who was a slaveholder, who had a baby with one of his slaves, he considered putting in the Declaration of Independence of freeing the slaves, but powerful people in the South or people involved in the founding of the nation wouldn't let him do that. And the same with the Constitution. I mean, it was part of the Constitution that, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies, all 13 states when the United States began. But a lot, John Adams and a lot of founding fathers knew slavery was a bad institution. Many fought to not let it continue when the United States began. But the idea that a lot of people thought that it would just fade away, that it would just go away. It was a bad institution. After its time, it wouldn't be necessary, and slavery would just slowly fade away. But that's not going to happen, because in the 1800s it's cotton, and that's going to increase the demand. And it would take a civil war to end slavery from 1861 to 1865. So now, I mean, in modern, it's always good to connect the past to today, and there's obviously a lot of emotions about the legacy of slavery and the long-term effects of it, and what should be due to repair the damage from the past and make life better and equal for everybody today. And I know right now, we have the 1619 Project, which tries to kind of show a different kind of version of history. I'm not saying true or false. I'm just saying, instead of 1776 being the beginning, 1619 being the beginning, because that's when the Africans came, and their contribution not only to the hard work of building the South and building the United States, but also with language and culture and religion, is a great contribution to what America is today. I would argue, though, that it wasn't the Africans didn't first come in 1619. They came before that, right? So I know that's controversial, and now there's a proposed 1776 project introduced by Donald Trump, which tries to show maybe the good thing instead of emphasis on the bad things. It's a controversy, but it's important to understand the history so you can make an argument, whatever it is, right? Rational minds on both sides can differ. So that's slavery. It's going to continue. It's continuity until the 1865. It influences the U.S. today. Now, we can't talk about English America or British America without going back and forth between Europe, because the influence, certainly in political ideas and religion and governance, is relevant and visible to this day. And of course, before, you see on the screen here, you have the English Civil War and you have the Glorious Revolution. So these are two big events that are going to influence English America in the 1600s. Now, before that, in the 1500s, we have the Protestant Reformation. That's going to be big because, the conflicts between the Spanish and the English, and the French, and even in America, there's some Catholics. The turmoil is going to be influential. And in fact, in the future, there'll only be one president, whoever was a Catholic, up to this date, and that's John F. Kennedy. But nonetheless, after the Protestant Reformation, one of the big influences in Europe on English America was the English Civil War. Now, the English Civil War. So I got to go back kind of in a little bit earlier with the kings and queens of England, right? And remember, the United States started as English or as British, right? That's where we were one. It was one nation. But as we mentioned last class, Queen Elizabeth She was very powerful. She was the Virgin Queen. That's why they named Virginia after her. She was very powerful. She was almost divine, right? And she had desire to go to the New World and to colonize it and make England powerful like Spain was. And of course, she would die in 1603, 4 years before Jamestown. So she never saw it. But after Queen Elizabeth, we have. Oh, I also mentioned she's a Protestant, right? She solidified Protestantism to be the religion of England, more specifically the Anglican Church, the Church of England, which there would be go back and forth between different Protestant denominations in England, but she kind of solidified it. And then 1607 happens, and she has already passed away, and then we have King James. And of course, Jamestown will be named after him. And after King James, we have somebody named Charles I. And Charles I will be the king when there's a war, and it's an English civil war, and it'll be against the parliamentarians, so Parliament, against the royalists, which means the king and his supporters. So as you can see, this is an 11-year war. It's a long war. And ultimately, Parliament would win this war, and King Charles I would be executed. And then Oliver Cromwell, who was actually a Puritan, still Protestant, but a Calvinist Puritan. And the Calvinist Puritans are the same people that went to Massachusetts Bay Colony and went to Plymouth, right? The Pilgrims and the Puritans. But he was executed, and then it wasn't really a king. It was Oliver Cromwell. He was a leader, and he would take over. But what's important here is, because this is all related to American history. That's kind of this series is all about American history. Is how does this relate to English America at this time? Well, from 1607 to about this time, the English really just let the colonists be alone. They just let them live their own lives. They didn't really control them. They kind of grew independently. I mean, they're still influenced. They still had royal colonies and whatnot, but they really let them just be, right? The English were busy, especially with the Civil War, so they just let them be. This is called salutary neglect. So solitary neglect in English American history is when the early colonists kind of grew and they kind of developed their own culture, right? Still being influenced by the English, but they developed independently. And after this English Civil War, with Parliament in control, or with Oliver Cromwell in control, they started to dominate the New World more, the English colonies more. They realized that, well, number one, these colonies are very valuable, right? Especially the ones in the Caribbean, which wouldn't become a part of America, right? Or the United States of America. I mean, until later, like Puerto Rico, which is a territory, but that's beside the point. These territories were quite, the English America was quite valuable, right? The resources that could be sent back, the tobacco, the rice, the indigo, or the raw material that could be sent back to England to help the motherland. And that became kind of the theme. Is like, let's use these colonies around the world belong to England, the great mother country, and send all the materials back, and we'll create manufactured goods, or we'll consume them. This is called mercantilism. So if you go back to this slide right here, if you see at the bottom of there, solitary neglect. This is when they didn't enforce the laws, or they didn't really control the colonies too much, and then it kind of, not just overnight but over time, turned into mercantilism, where they used the colonies to profit and control them. And of course, if you know what's going to happen in the future, it's going to be too much control by the British, and it's going to lead to the American Revolution, which leads to the United States of America. But this is kind of the beginning of them exerting more control, and they passed what is called the Navigation Act. This was in 1651, and this said, okay, well, you know what? If you're going to send these raw materials, you got to send them straight to England. You can't send them to the Dutch first. No. Everything that's going to go to other European nations has to come to us first. So this is exerting control. This is benefiting from the English, from the English colonies. So the English Civil War is important from an English American history perspective, because this is kind of the beginning. It's going to get more and more of exerting control over the colonies. Another event that's going to be very influential in the New World, in the English colonies, is a glorious revolution. All right. So let me go back and review a little bit. It's a lot. So you had Queen Elizabeth. She was there before the colonization began. She kind of ignited it, even though she died before it happened. Then you have James, King James I. Jamestown is named after him. Then you have Charles I, who was executed, right? And he was kind of sympathetic to the Catholics. Remember, in England, they're Protestant, they're Anglican and Puritan, and but mostly Anglican, which means the Church of England. But sympathizing with the Catholics is not going to go over too well with everybody in England. But nonetheless, Charles I will be executed, and it will be Cromwell, who was strict. He was from the Parliament. And then after he died, they would restore the monarch. And Charles II, who was in exile for 9 years, who was Charles I's son, will become the new king. And he was also very sympathetic to the Catholics, which is not a great idea in England at that time. Okay. Yes. Okay, so here. So after Charles II, James II would become the king, and he was sympathetic to the Catholics and to the French, and people didn't like that. So they had a coup d'etat. They took him out. And who did they replace him with? They replaced him with his daughter, whose name is Mary, and she's a Protestant. And she's married to William. So this is William and Mary. They would come over from the Netherlands, and they would peacefully or bloodlessly take over the reign of England and make it and preserve Protestantism. And I say bloodlessly because there was some blood, but it was relatively peaceful transfer of power in restoring this Protestant ideals. And James II is gone. And William and Mary, they're not going to exert so much strength as Charles I or Charles II or James II. They're going to be a little bit less to the English, that is, a little less strict than some of these autocratic kings and queens that came before, and they're going to have something called the Bill of Rights. And this is relevant to America because America would also have a Bill of Rights when they created their Constitution in 1787, many years later. But this will be influential. And one interesting thing about the Bill of Rights, the English Bill of Rights at this time, is they allowed people to have guns so they could protect themselves. And you fast forward to American history, Americans from the beginning has the Second Amendment, which allows them to have guns, and it's influenced by this. And ironically, England is in Britain, the UK cannot have guns today. But this is where it all started. So why is this important? The Glorious Revolution. Well, I already told you one is the influence of the Bill of Rights. And also, as I wrote in the slide here, in English America, or Britain America, at this time, people learned you can get rid of a king or queen because these are all powerful, divine. You can't get rid of them, right? But wow, that was pretty easy to get rid of William and Mary. And of course, less than 100 years later, they're going to do exactly the same thing. So number one, Glorious Revolution is important because it created this Bill of Rights, which will influence the future of the United States. Number two, the colonists learned that you could remove a king, and that's what they're going to do later. It should be mentioned in the colonies, in the English colonies at the time, they tried to hide about the Glorious Revolution. They didn't want people to know about it because they didn't want them to get these crazy ideas. But that made the people a little bit angrier, right? Okay, so that's Europe. Now we got to go back to the New World, to English America. So the colonies. So the colonies, um, again, after Virginia, it was Jamestown in Massachusetts. In between that, it was just not valuable. Nobody really cared about it, right? You had the Dutch in between them and the Swedes and different Europeans, and mostly Native Americans, but nobody really cared about that. They cared about the Caribbean. But as time goes on, more and more people are going to go to the colonies for different reasons, but mostly economic. In the 1600s, there was a huge population in England, and there was lots of poverty. So this was a chance to go and struggle, but at least there's land, and you have a chance. So there's going to be more and more English and other Europeans are going to come to what is English America. And as they do, when they go to places like Jamestown or Boston, they're gonna move out further west and west. They're gonna go more and more and more as more and more people come, and of course that's going to cause conflicts with the French and also the Native Americans. But as they move to different areas, they're going to create new colonies. Maybe purposely, or maybe they're just leaving Virginia, and then they go to a different area and they start Maryland, right? So sometimes it's purposeful, and sometimes it's just, for example, Thomas Hooker would leave Massachusetts and go to Connecticut with his congregation to start a new colony, right? He disagreed with some of the Puritan ideals, but yeah, this is how some of the new colonies would develop, and this is over 100 years that this would happen. It's not like you have 13 colonies, that's it. It took a long time. 100 years in historical terms is nothing, but when you look at it from our lifespan, that's a lot of time. So we'll start with Maryland. I'm going to go through not all of the colonies, but some of them. We've already talked about Virginia and Massachusetts, so this is the third one, and the third one is Maryland. Now, as I mentioned before, the English America, which would become British America, which would become America, the United States of America, was predominantly Protestant, right? So in the north, you have the Calvinists, who were the Puritans, and the Calvinists believed in predestination. And predestination is this idea that when you are born, it is decided if you're going to heaven or if you're going to hell. You can't just be good and believe in the Bible and go to heaven, right? It's predestined. And this was pretty strict, right? In Massachusetts, especially in the early 1600s, they wouldn't allow people to celebrate Christmas and dress certain ways. I mean, it was very, very strict. But these were the Calvinists in Massachusetts. Virginia, it was mostly Anglicans, Church of England. And of course, there's other religions or non-believers. I mean, it wasn't just black and white, but basically speaking, this is you got the Calvinists and Puritans in the north, Anglicans more in Virginia. Well, Maryland, and knowing that Catholic is not really is kind of frowned upon in England and also in English America. King Charles I, who was a Catholic sympathizer like King Charles II and James II, he gave Maryland to Cecilius Calvert, who was a Catholic, and this was supposed to be a haven for Catholics. Now, there wasn't a lot in the English colonies, but they weren't really safe up in Puritan Massachusetts, so they'd be banished or threatened. So they weren't really welcomed at this time in this early part of English colonial history. So they needed a safe haven, and that's what he set up. And they passed something called the Toleration Act. And that was basically they tolerated all religions. And when I say all religions, I mean Christian religions, right? Really no Muslims at this time, except for maybe some of the African slaves, but really Islam was not a part of the equation. Some Jewish people, like in New York in certain areas. But this was going to be a tolerate all religions, Christian religions, but it was mostly to give the Catholics a safe place to go, right? But then after the Glorious Revolution, which took place back in England, which we just talked about, where William and Mary took over for James II, and because he was almost Catholic and they were Protestant, it, Catholicism or Catholics would be illegal in Maryland. So at first it was basically a Catholic haven. Then later it became illegal. But that's Maryland, right? It's in between the Virginia and Massachusetts, right there, closer to Virginia. But this would also be a tobacco colony. All right. Next one is Connecticut. So I mentioned this already, but as you know, in Massachusetts, there's more and more people, and they would go west and north in different areas. And Thomas Hooker is one of them, and he brought his congregation to Massachusetts from Massachusetts, and he started Connecticut. And interesting enough, Yale, which was founded in sometime in the 1600s, was originally a very religious school to train people about the Bible and to become priests and preachers. And that helped preserve religion in this colony. So we have another colony outside of Massachusetts, which is not as strict as the Puritans or the Calvinists up there. That's called Connecticut. Like Connecticut, more and more people were in Massachusetts. They would leave and they would form new colonies. One was Connecticut, another was Rhode Island. And as I mentioned before, Massachusetts was very religiously intolerant, and a lot of people disagree with the strictness there. And one of those included Roger Williams. Now, Roger Williams at the time was considered radical because he was challenging the Calvinist religion of predestination and the strictness of their rituals. So he decided to go. So he left, and he wasn't really welcome in Massachusetts, and he founded a new one, which would be called Rhode Island. Now, he wanted to be more tolerant. He wanted to be more accepting of different religions, and also wanted to treat the Native Americans better. Of course, in the beginning, there were some good relationships with the Native Americans between the Jamestown settlers and some in Plymouth, but it wouldn't be long before their Native American land would be taken, and there would be conflicts between the Native Americans and the early settlers. But he thought he would purchase the land, right? He would buy the land from the Native Americans. For example, the Narragansett Native Americans in that area. And also, as I mentioned, they were more tolerant of different religions, so they had non-Puritans like Quakers and Jews living in Rhode Island. It was more of a religious and political freedom than Massachusetts. Okay. Next is New York, and I mentioned this a little bit in the last video. New York, of course, was founded by the Dutch. So, of course, Native Americans had been there for thousands of years, different tribes, and but for the Europeans, it would be the Dutch. It was Henry Hudson, who early part of the 1600s, who was English, but he was working for the Dutch. He came over and he went up what is now the Hudson River, which is the river next to Manhattan in New York City. And he went up that river looking for a northwest passage to Asia or to China, which is what Columbus was looking for, which was a long time ago, right? More than 150 years before. But he came and he didn't find this Northwest Passage. They didn't know how big America was, right, at that time. He didn't find that, but he did claim New York. It was called New Netherlands at the time for the Dutch. And New Amsterdam would be their cosmopolitan kind of center, which is Manhattan. And he would claim for the Dutch. And it wasn't until 1664 that the English would just take it from the Dutch without a fight, and also parts of New Jersey. So New York was originally Dutch, and it was in 1664 that the English just took it from them, right? And they named it New York. New Jersey would be much the same. It was also Dutch, and it was eventually turned into East and West Jersey. It was two colonies given to two proprietors, two people, two businessmen. And it was King Charles II. And remember, during the Civil War, the English Civil War, when King Charles, his father, got killed or got executed, there were people that were loyal to the royals. They were loyal to the king, and they helped King Charles II when he was in exile, right, after the English Civil War. And during this English Civil War, and two friends that helped him, he just gave it to them, like, land, here you are, here's your land. And it was East and West Jersey, and of course that would become New Jersey. All right. And one person who was living in, I believe it would have been West Jersey, was a guy by the name of William Penn, who was a Quaker, right? And he also wanted land. He had a very powerful father. In fact, King Charles II owed William Penn's father debt. And to repay that debt, he gave Pennsylvania, which means Penn's Woods, to William Penn. So that's how Pennsylvania came about. And it's one of the biggest gifts of land in world history, all this land from a king to one person. But Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, he's a Quaker, and the Quakers are pacifists. They were against slavery. They didn't want to fight wars, and they were against slavery. But he also wanted Pennsylvania, like Massachusetts, to be a model for other colonies, or for England, or I don't know, just different places. He wanted to be a model of a perfect society. Now, I don't want to make this sound like a utopian society. That was kind of more Massachusetts. They wanted this perfect, strict society that followed Calvinist ideals. But the model he wanted to set, the example that he wanted to set, was an example of religious tolerance and harmony, not a forced unity, kind of like in Massachusetts. He also purchased land from the Native Americans, kind of like in Rhode Island with Roger Williams. But he also, though he purchased the land from the Native Americans, after time they would break treaties and just kind of take the land. But at first, the ideal was to work with the Native Americans better than other colonies had at that time. Now, down south, we have the Carolinas, North and South Carolina, it would ultimately become. But again, Charles II is giving out land like crazy, but he granted the Carolinas to 8 lords proprietors, and these are the businessmen or the landowners. And it was just in return they helped him, become king again. That was after the English Civil War and after Oliver Cromwell. He helped, and they were in exile, or King Charles II was in exile in Jersey, which is near, not New Jersey, but Jersey over in England, an island there. He helped bring him back to power. So for their loyalty, he gave them the Carolinas. And this like Virginia, has a lot of land and a lot of, they can make a lot of rice and indigo. And with this land, they want more people. They want more settlers to work the land. They needed the slave labor or indentured servants or people just to own the land. So they encouraged more settlers to come. And to do that, they promised more religious tolerance, more political representation, and also land, right? So that attracted a lot of wealthy planters. So that would be the Carolinas. Now, the last one we have here is Georgia. Now, if you're looking at the dates, the other ones happened in the early to mid 1600s. This one's not until 1732, so this is a while after. In fact, originally this area was part of the Carolinas. But as you know, in Florida is Spain, New Spain, Catholics, which are the enemies of the English. So you have the Protestant English America, or British America by now. I'm going to call it British America. And then you have the Catholics, Spanish in Florida. And they didn't get along, and there was always worries of wars or attacks. So Georgia was really set up as a buffer to protect the English colonies against the Catholic Spanish. And it was also a penal colony. So this is a colony where they would send criminals or debtors, people that didn't pay their debt, to go. So it's kind of like a penal colony in its origination. Okay, so thus far we've talked a lot, and this is all kind of going back and forth between 1607 and 1754. And we talked about the institution of slavery, which would be a continuity in American history until 1865. We also talked about the influences of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution on the English colonies. And of course, throughout this time, there's going to be rebellion, there's going to be war, there's going to be revolts. It's going to shape history, especially when you consider all the Europeans coming to this new world, and they need to find space, so they're going to go west. In the west, you're going to find the Native Americans who have been there for a long time, who are some are going to work with English, and some are going to want to trade and be welcoming, but others are going to resent them, right? They don't want them taking over their territory. They don't want their pigs and their horses stomping on their crops and ruining their food. So conflicts would inevitably ensue. The first one I want to talk about is the Pequot War, 1637. Now this happened up in the Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island area, and the English were encroaching on the Pequot land, and let's see here. I'm sorry, I have to look at my notes. They, originally they had some good relationships with the settlers, but they were encroaching more and more on their land, and naturally conflict would ensue. I'm going to jump to the third point here on the slide. During this war, there's something called the Mystic Massacre. This happened near the Mystic River. There's a small village of Pequot Indians, and they were in their little village, which was circled by a wall, a wooden wall. And what the Puritans or the English did was they set this village on fire, and they waited outside. There's only two exits. So they waited by the exits, or they waited around the wall to see if people jumped. Anybody that jumped over, they would shoot. The rest would be burned. And there were women and children in there. So this was a massacre of maybe 400 to 700 Pequots that were burned to death, that were killed in this massacre. So that shows you how bloody the war was. And it also shows you, or it also give the native tribes, not just the Pequots but other ones in that area, a bad feeling about the English settlers, right? So the relationship between the English and the natives would deteriorate and continue for many, many years. But why is this one important? When you look at it in the context of English American history or just American history, this would open up the land for the native for the English settlers, because the Pequots would be forced out of this area. So there's more land, and the English settlers could expand even more. And also some of the Pequot captives or the prisoners of war were sent to the Caribbean, and they would become slaves there. So those are a couple of reasons why this is important. Now the English are free to move even further, but there's still other Native American tribes there, and there's going to be more conflict as well. And that brings us to King Philip's War. So this picture here, you have King Philip, and of course his name wasn't King Philip. That's the name the English gave him. His name was Metacomet. But a lot of the history books just call this King Philip's War. But like the Spanish, the English also wanted to Christianize or proselytize the natives to becoming Christians or their form of Christianity, and some did become Christians, and often they were called praying Indians, right? A praying Indian is somebody who did convert to Christians, and often adapted other cultural practices of the English. But there's this one guy, his name was John Sassaman. He was a praying Indian, and he went to Harvard. He was well educated, and he was killed, right, by a Native American, supposedly, right? But this made the English angry, right? The English were angry because they killed John Sassaman, right? He's not English, but he was adapting to the English way of life, and also if you kill somebody in this society, you get punished. So in return, well, first of all, the English were told that Metacomet, or King Philip, it was his men, that they killed this praying Indian, and that they were planning on attacking some Native American, English settlements, English cities, maybe get to Boston. So they went and they found 3 people that supposedly killed John Sassaman, the praying Indian, and they executed them, right, for their punishment. So in return, the Metacomet's men killed 9 of the English, So a war would ensue. So Metacomet was a Wampanoag. That was the native tribe there. There were more tribes involved in this conflict, but that was the major tribe there. But this would take more than a year of brutal war. And like the Pequot War, the English would defeat Metacomet and his men. And the Wampanoags and some other tribes that were helping the Wampanoags would be sent, or they would be out of the area, giving them even more free space to encroach or to move and expand the English further up north and further west. And tribes, captives would also be sent to the Caribbean as slaves. Okay. All right, the next one is Bacon's Rebellion. This happened in 1676. So, again, like I said in the earlier slide about the timeline, it's hard to remember all these dates. So if you can just chunk it into different time periods. In this series, I'm going to do 9 time periods. This is the time period 2. This is easy to remember. This is exactly 100 years before the American Revolution. Actually, well, at least the Declaration of Independence, 1776. But this one's not going to be in New England. And when I say New England, I'm talking about the Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island area. This one's going to be down in Virginia at Jamestown. And it also involved Native Americans, but it was more complex. Basically, there was some Native Americans who, it started over a dispute about a pig. Right, so some Native Americans they were trading with the English settlers in Virginia, and there was some plantation owner or worker on some plantation, and he owed some money or something. I'm not sure what kind of money it would have been. Maybe it would have been silver, or wampum, or something. I'm not exactly sure, but they owed a debt, and he refused to pay it, and so they stole his pigs. They stole 3 of his pigs. Well, that would lead to him getting killed. There'd be a conflict, and this plantation worker would get killed. And the news spread around that Native Americans killed this plantation worker. And then there would be attacks on both sides of killing people, innocent people. Right? These were the Doegs, Doeg. Excuse my pronunciation. If anybody can help me with that, I would appreciate it. But other Native American tribes got caught in the middle. So it wasn't just this tribe, it was other Native American tribes. They would get caught in the middle. And in fact, some of the settlers would take matters into their own hand and attack Native Americans just for being Native Americans. It was like in retribution for what was happening. And to be fair, certainly some of the settlers who were moving out west were in fear of their lives of Native American attacks at this time. But nonetheless, the main issue here is the settlers, the English settlers, have a fear. And a lot of these people are indentured servants or poor white farmers or different people in the backcountry. They have a fear for their life, and they think that the governor, whose name is William Berkeley of Jamestown, he should protect the colonists. And people were already not very happy with Berkeley for numerous reasons. One, taxes, which is another continuity in American history, but also being too friendly with the Native Americans, right? Profiting from the trade, which he was, or which was good for the colony, right? He didn't want to wage war on the Native Americans, especially because there was different tribes. Like, which tribe do we declare war on, right? Some innocent tribes who had nothing to do with some of these conflicts were getting killed by white settlers. And he wanted to avoid offensive war. So what he did was very pragmatic, but it was very bad for PR, public relations. He did a defensive war. He built a wall around Jamestown, and he said, okay, we're going to still trade with them, but we're just going to defend ourselves. And again, looking at it from historical perspective, it actually was quite a rational decision, but it was a bad PR because you have a lot of emotional settlers who fear for their lives, who think that their government is not protecting them. And they're going to be very angry. And there's going to be this guy named Nathaniel Bacon. He graduated from Cambridge, and he'd only been in Virginia for 2 years. And a strong leader, he got some men to take action into their own hands, and they started attacking some Native Americans and killing them. Now, Berkeley didn't like this. He thought Bacon was challenging him. He thought it was a coup. that he was trying to replace William Berkeley, which maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Bacon kind of fought for the common man, the poor indentured servant type of guy. But really, I think Bacon had other aspirations of power and becoming a leader. But nonetheless, there was a conflict between Bacon and Governor Berkeley. And in fact, they almost got into a duel where they challenged each other, right? It was actually Berkeley who challenged him to a duel. And he ripped open his chest. And he said, shoot me, shoot me. It was like a standoff in Jamestown. Bacon never shot him. But the local government there called the House of Burgesses, they did make Bacon a general in the army, in the local army. So he did gain some power. But nonetheless, the duel got pretty out of hand, or the conflict between this turned into a battle between the local Native Americans and the settlers, into kind of a little civil war, right, and a little rebellion in Jamestown in the Virginia area, and some of these Bacon's men actually burned down Jamestown. And there's chaos, people stealing stuff, stealing private property and looting stuff, and just like no rule of law. It was even Bacon said, this is our time of anarchy. So things got out of control, and then Bacon just died. Not from fighting, but he got sick. And when he got sick, his settlers stopped. It was over. This Bacon's rebellion was over. And Berkeley took some of his leaders and he executed them, killed them. And at about that time, shortly after, the English arrived to restore law and order, right? To restore stability after this internal conflict. But this is important. There's numerous reasons that this is important. One, I mean, significance. 100 years before the big rebellion, the American Revolution. It's kind of a look into the future. It's the local people fighting against their government for perceived harm to them or not doing their job. So even Thomas Jefferson later would reference Bacon as a strong, rebellious type of personality. So that's one. There was talks about separating from England during the Bacon's Rebellion, and we know that's going to happen 100 years later. And also the indentured servants, they fought back, right? And it also kind of showed some of the plantation owners or the elite in Jamestown that maybe these indentured servants can't be trusted. Maybe we need to find other workforces. So this kind of increased the demand for African slaves, among other reasons. But indentured servants, they're going to fight back. We can't trust them, right? So these are among the reasons that the Bacon's Rebellion is very important. And to compare this to modern history, I mean, look what's happening in 2020. There's a perceived incompetence or corruption or mistreatment by the government or by the police, and people want to fight back. And in doing so, there's a lot of burning. Some cities like Portland and Kenosha have seen some looting and burning. So, and this is many years later. So it's the way people react to mistreatment is similar throughout the ages. Now, going away from English America or British America, I want to go back to New Spain, and this is in Santa Fe, which is modern-day New Mexico. Now, of course, the Spanish have been there much longer than the English, and they were more dispersed, but they had a larger area, and they were all the way into the California area and into the Southwest and a little bit north of that, and throughout Mexico and the Caribbean. Still powerful. English are going to start becoming the most powerful soon, but in 1680, about the time all these conflicts are happening in English America with the Native Americans, there's a very significant one that happened in 1680 called the Pueblo Revolt. It's also called Pope's Rebellion. Pope was the leader of the local Pueblo people, and they fought back against the Spanish, who had been mistreating them for God, almost 200 years. They fought back, and this was they fought back, and they actually killed how many? 4,000 people. Let me just check my notes. They killed 4,000 Spanish in Santa Fe, and they banished them. So this was a great victory for the Native Americans in Santa Fe. And it would be 12 years before the Spanish came back, because at this time the Europeans kept coming and coming and coming, right? The Spanish and the English and the French and the Dutch, and they would eventually retake Santa Fe. But this was a great victory for the Native Americans. But you're seeing this similarity happen of conflicts between people with different ideas, different religions. When they get together, sometimes a war does break out. Okay, well, that was a lot, and I hope you kind of get a general idea of the time period. It's hard to put ourselves into, you know, 400 years ago, what it was like. It's hard to kind of imagine it, but just imagine it was a challenge for these settlers and these colonists to just survive. And it was a challenge for the Native Americans to continue their way of life with all these settlers coming into this new land. And the land needed to be worked, and they didn't have enough labor, so they forced people. And this started the institution of slavery, which had started with the Native Americans, and then the Spanish, the Portuguese, and the English. And that would cause lots of problems for many years for the Africans in America, until the end of slavery and after that, right? And still conflicts today over the legacy of slavery, and debates on how equal the United States is today. But it was also the influences from Europe that influenced the New World and the English America, but will continue, right? There's going to be some ideas. In the 1700s, we're going to have Enlightenment ideas that are going to influence some of the early founding fathers that are going to form this new government, right? Which will someday become the United States of America. So if you made it all the way to this end of this video, really appreciate it. Again, please check out, if you want this PPT, you can use it. Just check the link below. I also have some timelines that might be interested, like if you're a teacher or even a student, it could be useful. And if you have any questions or comments, or if there's anything I said that was wrong or misleading or biased, or if you have some additional information you can add to what I've included here, I would love to hear in the comments. And I'm always learning, and I do make mistakes. So thank you so much. I'll have another video next week for you. See you.